The Whitfield house smelled like pot roast and privilege, but for Zara, it might as well have been a prison with good lighting. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, her fingers shaking against the mop handle as she finished the list of chores her foster mother, Linda, had designed to break her. Gerald Whitfield didn't glance up from his recliner when he jabbed a finger toward the front door. "You've been nothing but a drain since day one," he growled. "Take your attitude and get out of my sight." He pushed her into the throat of a raging snowstorm with nothing but a worn olive-green jacket that hadn't seen warmth in years. Zara walked until her knees buckled and her breath dissolved into thin, shattered wisps, collapsing at the edge of the road as her body finally surrendered to the cold. Gerald watched from the window for exactly 3 seconds before pulling the curtain shut. What he hadn't counted on, what he never could have calculated, was the black SUV parked just beyond the bend in the road. The man who stepped out, charcoal overcoat cutting through the blizzard like a blade, his gaze hard and immediately fixed on the girl crumpled in the snow, was Park Seo-jin. To the Whitfields, Zara was an inconvenience they were done tolerating. To the most feared Korean mafia boss in the city, she was about to become the only thing in the world that mattered. Hello family, welcome to Gloria Afro-Korean Stories. Before we continue, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now let's get back to the story. The Whitfield house was a lie told in warm tones. From the street, it was a picture-perfect snapshot of suburban comfort, the kind of home featured on real estate listings with words like charming and move-in ready. There were flower wreaths on the door, and a welcome mat that hadn't welcomed Zara a single day of the 2 years she had lived there. She stood now at the edge of the hallway, her slight frame barely casting a shadow in the golden light that poured in from the living room. The hollow in her stomach had passed hunger 3 days ago and settled into something quieter and more dangerous, a deep cellular emptiness that made the world tilt slightly whenever she stood too fast. Linda Whitfield moved through the kitchen the way women like her always did, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had never missed a meal in their life. Her auburn hair was pinned back flawlessly, her expression one of careful, rehearsed neutrality as she arranged the dinner plates with geometric precision. She didn't look at Zara when she spoke. "The windows in the upstairs hall are streaked again, Zara. I don't know what you do with your time, but clean doesn't seem to be part of it." Zara's throat was dry, her voice a fragile thing she had to reach for carefully. "I'm sorry, Linda. I got a little lightheaded today. I'll go do them again right now." From the table, the Whitfield children, Marcus and Sienna, exchanged a glance loaded with contempt. Marcus, 17 and built like he had already practiced being his father, pushed his half-empty glass off the edge of the table and let it shatter on the tile Zara had just mopped. He raised an eyebrow at her. "Looks like you've got more to do anyway." Sienna laughed, tossing her highlighted hair over one shoulder, her eyes traveling over Zara's natural coils and worn clothing with a slow, dismissive sweep. She had a gift for cruelty that required no volume. A single look that communicated exactly how little Zara registered in her world. The abuse in the Whitfield house was not the kind that left visible marks. It lived in the space between things, in the dinners Zara watched from doorways while the family ate, in the grocery lists that never included her preferences, in the way Linda would fold Zara's clothing incorrectly and then berate her for the wrinkles. For 3 days, Zara had kept herself going on water from the bathroom tap, and the memory of a bread crust she had found tucked behind a container in the pantry. Her body had started to feel translucent, like the weight of her own suffering had begun to physically erase her from the world. Gerald Whitfield came into the room the way men like him always entered spaces, heavily, as though his presence alone demanded rearrangement. He looked at the dinner spread, then at Zara, with the same expression a man uses when he finds a receipt for something he never ordered. He didn't see a girl 3 days into starvation, trembling and hollowed out. He saw a line item on a budget that was no longer worth the expense. "Linda says you've been giving attitude again," Gerald said, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless authority of a man who had never once questioned himself. He didn't pause for her response. He crossed the room in 4 heavy strides and threw the front door open. The blizzard came in immediately, violent and indiscriminate, swallowing the warmth of the hallway in seconds. The wind was a living thing, A wall of white noise and ice that turned the threshold of the home into something hostile and absolute. The temperature dropped so sharply that Zara felt it in her back teeth. Gerald reached into the coat closet and pulled out her jacket, the olive green one with the broken zipper and the worn-through lining, and flung it at her feet without ceremony. "Get out until you can remember how to behave in someone else's house," he said. "Maybe the cold will teach you the gratitude you've been too proud to show us. Don't come back until you've decided to be useful." Zara looked at Linda, searching her face for the smallest flicker of something human. Linda was reorganizing the salt and pepper shakers. She looked at Marcus and Sienna, who were already loading their plates, the steam from the roast curling upward in a slow, beautiful taunt. "Please," Zara said, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "There's a blizzard. I have nowhere to go tonight." Gerald's hand closed around the doorframe. "The street is somewhere," he said. "It's more than you've earned." And then the door was closing, and then it was closed, and the sound of the deadbolt sliding home cracked through Zara like something breaking inside a wall, a structural thing, the last support giving way. The storm swallowed her instantly. The cold was not a temperature, it was a presence, a force that pressed against her from every direction, and began immediately to work on the exposed skin of her face and hands. She pulled the olive jacket closed, but the broken zipper left a gap at her sternum that let the wind cut straight through to her chest, where a thin burgundy long sleeve was the only other barrier between her and the night. The world in front of her was a seamless white void, the road indistinguishable from the lawns, the sidewalk invisible beneath 2 feet of drifted snow. She walked because stopping felt like agreeing to something she wasn't ready to agree to. She looked back once. The living room window of the Whitfield house glowed amber and warm. She could see the silhouettes of the family moving, sitting, settling into the comfortable rhythm of a meal. They were laughing about something. She could not hear it over the storm, but she could see the shape of it, the open mouths, the ease of it, the way none of them had even reached the window to check. They had not watched her go. She turned back to the dark road, her natural coils already heavy with ice. Each curl weighed down as though the storm was trying to anchor her to the ground. The hunger that had been a dull ache for days began to shift into something softer and more frightening. A seductive quiet that whispered about rest. The streetlights ahead went out one by one. The darkness that replaced them was total. Zara's legs gave out somewhere between the 3rd and 4th house from the corner, and she went down into the snow without a sound, a small, still figure in an olive jacket in the middle of a blizzard. The world reducing her to exactly the nothing the Whitfields had always insisted she was. The black SUV had been idling at the bend in the road for 11 minutes. Inside it, the air was the particular brand of tense silence that follows men who deal in violence for a living. Park Seo-jin's crew were not soft men. They were the kind of soldiers who had seen things that rewired the way a person processed the world, who moved through the city like shadows attached to a man who could end dynasties with a single phone call. They had been waiting for their boss to return from a brief perimeter check, a habit of his, a ritual of control and awareness that had kept him alive when lesser men had fallen. They were not prepared for what he came back carrying. Seo-jin had seen her from 30 meters out, a shape too still to be safe in a storm like this. He had moved toward her without thinking, the instinct in his body older and faster than reason. He was crouched beside her before his men had even registered the change in his trajectory. Up close, she was younger than he had feared and worse off than he had expected. Her lips had begun to blue at the edges. Her lashes were frosted. Her hands, curled near her face in the snow, were the color of ash. He got his arms beneath her, one at her back and one beneath her knees, and lifted her with the careful precision of a man who understood that some things, handled wrong, cannot be undone. When the SUV door opened and Seo-jin stepped into the cabin with Zara in his arms, the silence that fell was the kind that has weight. His lead enforcer, Do-hyun, turned from the front passenger seat, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and alarm. The driver didn't move. Seo-jin settled into the seat, adjusting Zara's head so it rested against his chest rather than lolling loose against his arm. His face, usually a locked room, showed something his men had no reference for. His jaw was tight, but it wasn't the tightness of anger. It was the tightness of a man holding something in that he didn't have language for yet. Heat, he said. All of it. Now. He felt her cold radiating into him through his overcoat like a warning. Drive to the penthouse. Do-hyun cleared his throat with the careful precision of a man testing a tripwire. Boss. The Busan delegation. They've been waiting at the summit location for 20 minutes. We should at minimum call ahead, maybe redirect her to a hospital and… Seojin's gaze lifted from Zara's face and found Do-hyun's in the rearview mirror. The look was not loud. It didn't need to be. The Busan delegation can continue waiting, Seojin said. His baritone dropping to a register that his men knew was not a beginning of a conversation, but an end to one. Or they can leave. Either outcome is acceptable to me. We are going to the penthouse. The driver pulled out without another word. The SUV moved through the deserted white city, the heater working fast and hard against the cold that had ridden in with them. Do-hyun faced forward, his mouth a careful flat line. Around the cabin, the other men found places to look that were not at their boss, because what they were seeing did not fit the architecture of the man they served. Park Seojin did not stop for strangers. Park Seojin did not abandon summits over a girl in a broken jacket. Park Seojin did not sit in the back of a vehicle holding someone the way you hold something you are afraid of losing. Yet here he was, pressing the back of his bare hand, glove removed, against the cheek of a girl whose name he did not know. Pulling her closer when he felt how truly cold she was. Watching her face with an intensity that belonged to a different kind of man than the one his reputation described. He looked out the window as the city slid past, blurred and glittering through the snow. He had caught a clear view of the house when she had been shoved out of it. The warm light. The solid door. The shape of a man in the window who had turned away. Something in Seojin's chest had tightened at that image, and had not loosened since. He looked back down at Zara. A single bead of water tracked down her temple. The last of the frost melting in the warmth of the cabin. Catching the light like something precious. Who did this to you, he thought. The words not spoken but felt with a clarity that surprised him. I need to know who did this to you. Behind him, the city of Seoul sprawled in frozen silence. Ahead of him, the penthouse towers rose into the clearing storm. And inside him, something old and sealed and carefully maintained had begun, without his permission, to open. The penthouse existed in a different physics from the rest of the world. The noise of the city did not reach it. The cold did not touch it. It was a space engineered for the life of a man who controlled his environment with the same absolute authority he applied to everything else. Clean lines, dark materials, light that could be adjusted to match a mood, air that smelled like cedar and quiet wealth. Zara woke into it slowly. The way a person surfaces from very deep water, layer by layer, the warmth registering before consciousness, the softness of the surface beneath her arriving before the ceiling above her made any sense. The ceiling was dark slate, veined with gray, reflecting the low amber burn of a fireplace she couldn't yet see but could feel. She was under a blanket that weighed almost nothing and held heat like a second skin. The clothing she was wearing was not hers. An oversized knit pullover in deep charcoal that fell past her hips, the fabric so fine it felt like it had been made specifically to apologize for every rough thing the world had ever pressed against her skin. She tried to push herself upright, and her arms shook with the effort. Easy, said the voice. It was low and even, and it came from a chair positioned at an angle near the window, where the Seoul skyline glittered behind a wall of glass. Park Seojin sat there with his long frame at rest, his overcoat gone, his dark shirt precise and unwrinkled in that particular way of men who have made discipline a physical practice. He was watching her with an expression that she did not yet have context for. Not hunger, not pity. Something more careful than either. You've been unconscious for 4 hours, he said. Your temperature is back to a safe level. But you should move slowly. Zara's instincts fired all at once in different directions. She looked at the room, then at the door, then back at the man, cataloging exits and threats in the way that years in difficult homes teaches a person to do before anything else. He noticed. He didn't move toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, hands visible, posture open. I am not going to hurt you, he said. That is not why you are here. He rose after a moment and walked to the low table beside the bed, where a ceramic bowl sat on a small tray, wisps of steam still rising from its surface. He sat at the edge of the mattress with the care of someone fully aware of how the weight of him might read to a person who had reason to be afraid. He lifted the bowl and the spoon together and held them toward her. not pushing them into her hands but presenting them like an offering she had the right to refuse. Zara looked at the food and her stomach clenched with a need so sharp it almost embarrassed her. It was a rich broth with soft rice and what looked like carefully placed slices of something delicate and pale. It was the most intentional thing she had ever been offered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was rough at the edges but steadier than she expected it to be. She was not going to be a girl who looked away. "You don't know me." Seojin met her eyes without flinching. "I know enough," he said. "I know that someone put you in a blizzard with a jacket that was already a failure before the storm started. I know you didn't make a sound when I picked you up, which tells me you've learned to carry pain without advertising it." He paused, something moving behind his expression, a tide of something precise and cold directed at a target that was not her. "And I know that whoever decided you were disposable made the kind of mistake that has consequences." He extended the bowl again. "Eat first. Everything else after." She ate. And with each spoonful the hollow that had lived in her chest for 3 days began to fill. Not just with warmth but with something harder to name, a slow, structural reinforcement, like watching a building that has been leaning finally find its plumb. Seojin sat beside her and did not hurry her, and did not look away. When the bowl was empty he set it aside and looked at her with a directness that was not invasive but was absolute. "Tell me their name," he said quietly. "The people who put you in the snow. I'm not asking so that I can act without your agreement. I'm asking because you deserve to know that someone intends to make this right." Zara looked at him for a long moment. She had learned early that powerful men came with conditions, that warmth was always a currency being exchanged for something. But Park Seojin was looking at her the way someone looks at a thing they are not yet sure they deserve to be near. And she found, to her own surprise, that she believed him. "The Whitfields," she said. "Gerald and Linda Whitfield." Seojin nodded once. He reached out and rested his hand beside hers on the duvet, not on top of it, just beside it, close enough to feel without demanding anything. "Then rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow the correction begins. Tonight, you are the only thing in this city that I am thinking about." And for the first time in longer than she could measure, Zara closed her eyes and let someone else carry the weight. By the second morning, the penthouse had been reorganized around her. Zara understood this without being told. The way you understand things that are demonstrated rather than explained. When she woke, a private doctor was already waiting in the adjoining room. A woman with a quiet authority and a medical bag that looked like it cost more than the Whitfield family's monthly grocery budget. There were no cold intake forms. No fluorescent lights. No questions delivered in the tone of someone who has already decided not to believe the answers. There was only the careful, professional work of someone who had been instructed to prioritize one patient above every other consideration. Seojin stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back to the room. But Zara could see his reflection in the glass. He watched the examination without speaking, but every time she flinched, his jaw tightened with a controlled fury that he did not let into his voice. When the doctor finished and leaned close to murmur her findings, Zara caught the relevant words. Prolonged caloric restriction. Micronutrient depletion. The effects of sustained neglect, measured and named. She saw Seojin's reflection close its eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned and gave the doctor a set of quiet, absolute instructions that left no room for interpretation. Everything she was denied. All of it. Beginning now. After the medical team left, 2 women arrived with a rack of clothing that made Zara go still in the way you go still when you see something you weren't sure existed. There were no hand-me-downs with subtle damage designed to humiliate. There were no colors chosen to make her disappear. There were coats in heavy brocade and wool, sweaters in cashmere that felt like something a person might be given on their birthday if their birthday had ever been treated as something worth marking. Seojin moved through the rack once, deliberate and unhurried, and pulled free a coat in deep plum. The lining inside it a warm bronze silk that caught the light and held it. He walked it to where Zara stood and held it open for her. "The people who kept you in that olive jacket wanted you to feel like you took up too much space," he said. "I want you to feel like you are exactly the right size for the world you're about to walk back into." She let him set the coat on her shoulders. She let herself look in the mirror. And what she saw was not the girl who had been told, through 1,000 small and calculated acts, that she was barely worth the trouble of keeping. The girl in the mirror was standing inside a coat the color of a winter sunset, her natural coils falling full and perfect around a face that was beginning, slowly and visibly, to remember itself. The status shift was not loud. It didn't announce itself. But it was absolute. Zara looked at her own reflection, and something in her chest clicked into place like a door finally seated correctly in its frame. She was not what they had said she was. She had known it in theory for years. She was only now, in this mirror, in this coat, beginning to believe it in her bones. The days that followed moved with the quiet momentum of something inevitable. Seojin did not crowd her. He did not make her feel like a project or a prize. He gave her space and he gave her access to the penthouse library, to the kitchen where the staff had been informed that her preferences were to be taken as seriously as his own, to the long window seat that overlooked the south side of the city, where she spent the first 3 mornings simply sitting and watching Seoul wake up, as though she were relearning the size of the world after being made to live in something very small. He came and sat beside her on the 4th morning with 2 cups of something warm, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then, with his gaze still on the skyline, he said, "I grew up without much either. People assume power means the absence of scarcity. But I remember what it feels like to be the person in the room that no one is directing food toward." Zara looked at his profile. He had a face built for authority, strong-lined and serious, but she had begun to notice the moments when something else moved through it. He turned and looked at her, and the something else was there now. That hint of vulnerability that didn't fit the legend attached to his name. "I am not telling you this so that you feel obligated toward me," he said. "I am telling you because I want you to know that I am not surprised by you. The parts of you that they tried to hollow out. I recognize those. And I know what they can become." Zara looked at him for a long moment. She had spent years being invisible in the same room as people who claimed to care for her. Park Seojin looked at her the way you look at something you have decided, completely and without reservation, to keep safe. It was the most disorienting thing she had ever experienced. More disorienting than the storm. More disorienting than the door slamming. She said quietly, "Why me?" And he said, just as quietly, "Because you were still there. After everything they did, you were still there. That takes a particular kind of strength, Zara. The kind that doesn't announce itself. I've spent my entire career learning to recognize exactly that kind of strength. I wasn't looking for you. But I found you. And now that I have, the idea of a world where I didn't is something I refuse to spend time imagining." What happened next in the city below was not something Zara witnessed directly. She knew about it the way you know about weather when you are inside a well-built room. Present and aware. Registered through the details rather than the full force of it. She knew that Seojin had moved against the Whitfields with the systematic precision of someone who understood that the most devastating consequences are the structural ones. The ones that remove the scaffolding that comfortable people assume will always be there. Gerald's contracting firm, which had existed on a network of quiet corruption and connections he had spent 20 years cultivating, stopped receiving contracts. The investigation that followed moved with the particular speed of something that had been assisted. The mortgage on the Whitfield house, which had its own irregularities when someone looked carefully, came under review. The review widened. The accounts moved. Seojin explained none of the specific mechanics to Zara. What he said was, "The money that should have come to you through your parents' estate was redirected the year after you entered their care. We've corrected the direction." She sat with that for a moment. She said, "All of it?" He said, with appropriate interest, "For the years it was held incorrectly." He was not boasting. He was delivering information with the calm of someone who had simply completed a task that needed completing. Zara looked at her hands and then back at him. She thought of Gerald's voice. She thought of Linda's back, deliberately turned. She thought of 3 days of tap water and a bread crust. She thought of the sound of the deadbolt. She said, "Thank you." He shook his head once. "Don't thank me for giving you back something that was already yours." The night the Whitfields learned the full weight of what was coming was the night Seojin's men brought information that a secondary threat had emerged. A former business associate of Gerald's who had decided that the disruption of the Whitfield arrangement was an opportunity. Zara was in the library when Do-hyun came to the door with the news. Seojin was already moving, already calibrated, already in the space between planning and action where she had come to understand he was most completely himself. She stopped him at the door. She had been reading financial documents for 3 days at that point, learning the architecture of her own stolen history. She had found the secondary account herself, the one that connected Gerald's associate to a property holding that Seojeon's team had not yet identified. She showed it to him without ceremony. He looked at it, and then looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not vulnerability this time, but something more mutual. Recognition. He said, "You found this in the documentation?" She said, "You gave me the documentation." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." She went. She did not stand in the background. She sat at the table where Do-hyun and 2 other senior men were working through the network. And she pointed to the connections she had traced, quietly and precisely, the lines between accounts and holding companies that 3 days of reading had made clear to her in a way that years of practice might not have given someone else, because Zara had spent her life learning to identify the hidden architecture of systems designed to keep things from her. Seojeon's men looked at her, and then at their boss. He gave them nothing to look at but work. They worked. When the operation concluded and the secondary threat had been handled, and the final pieces of Gerald's network had been fully dismantled, the silence in the penthouse was thick and clean. Seojeon came to the doorway where Zara stood, and crossed the room to her without stopping. He pulled her in with both arms, a hold that was not careful in the way his touches usually were, but real and urgent and with a weight of feeling that he had been managing carefully, and had now decided to stop managing. He said into her hair, "I would have been slower without you. May be wrong." She closed her eyes and leaned into him. She was not the girl in the olive jacket anymore. That girl had walked into a storm and not come back. The woman who had replaced her was standing in a penthouse in a plum coat with her arms around a dangerous man who had, somehow, become the safest place she had ever been. The night the Whitfields lost everything was cold and clear. The storm long spent, the sky hard and full of stars. 3 black SUVs were parked in the driveway of the house when Gerald came to the window. The power in the Whitfield home had been cut. The heat was gone. The rooms that had always glowed with comfortable warmth were dark in a way that felt specific, intentional, like a lesson being administered. Gerald sat on the leather sofa in his coat, already wearing it because the cold inside the house had become indistinguishable from the cold outside it. Linda sat beside him, her careful composure finally fractured, her hands pressed together in her lap. Marcus and Sienna were on the floor near the fireplace that no longer worked, the particular arrogance of the Whitfield children having apparently required this exact set of circumstances to vacate their faces entirely. The front door, the same door that had been used as a weapon, opened without drama. Seojeon entered the dark room and stood aside. And then Zara walked in. She was wearing the plum coat. Her coils were full and free around her face. She walked through the foyer where she had shivered in an olive jacket with a broken zipper, and she stood before the family that had spent 2 years trying to convince her she was barely worth the electricity it took to keep the lights on. Gerald made a sound she did not have a word for. He got off the sofa and moved toward her with his hands out. "Zara," he said. His voice was completely different from the voice he used to push her through the door. "There's been a misunderstanding. We were trying to help you. We were always trying to help you. This isn't what it looks like. You put me in a blizzard," Zara said. Her voice was even. She was not performing calm. She was calm. She had found, in the past week, that the truth did not require volume to be devastating. "You put me in a storm with 3 days of starvation in my body, and a jacket with a broken zipper. And then you went and had dinner." Linda stood up. "Zara, please. Think about the children. Think about what happens to them. We can repay everything. The accounts, whatever Park Seo-jin's people took, we can negotiate. We can make this right." Seo-jin stood near the door, his hand resting near his side with the particular stillness of a man who is waiting for a word. He was looking at Zara and only Zara. Whatever she said next was what would happen. She knew this. It was the most power she had ever held in a room. She looked at Gerald on the floor. She thought about the deadbolt. She thought about Linda's back. She thought about Marcus's glass, deliberately knocked to the tile she had just cleaned. She thought about 3 days of tap water. She thought about the abalone porridge that Seo-jin had held toward her with a patience she hadn't known how to receive yet. She looked at Seojin and she said, "Let them go." He was still for a moment. Then he nodded. She turned back to Gerald. "You walk out of here tonight the way I walked out," she said. "Coat, no bag, no phone. You find out what the street gives you. And you spend whatever is left of your life being grateful that I am not the kind of person you tried to make me into." Gerald opened his mouth. She did not wait to hear it. She turned toward the door. Seojin's men parted and the Whitfield family shuffled out into the night, past the black SUVs, into the cold that had no sympathy for people encountering it for the first time. Zara stood in the empty house for a moment. She looked at the kitchen counter where Linda had stood, her back perfectly turned. She looked at the front door. She looked at the floor she had scrubbed for 2 years. Then she turned and walked out, and Seojin fell into step beside her. And the door was left open behind them. The cold moving through the rooms the way it had always wanted to. The SUV was waiting. Zara got into the warmth and the door closed and the city lit up around them as the car moved, and Seoul at night was an enormous and luminous thing, full of lives being lived in directions she had not yet imagined. Seojin sat beside her.